He thought his badge made him untouchable. He thought pointing a gun at a grieving black general, even at a funeral, would disappear like every other abuse before. But this time, the world did not turn away. This time, justice did not blink. When the gavel dropped and a racist cop was sentenced to life in prison, it wasn't just a verdict, it was a reckoning for every silent grave, every ignored complaint, and every buried truth. This is not just his story, it is the story of how one man's arrogance collided with a nation's demand for justice. It was supposed to be a day of mourning, a day for honoring the life of a fallen soldier. General Marcus Jefferson, a decorated military officer, was at his son's funeral. A moment of profound grief for any parent. But what transpired that day would change his life forever and send shockwaves throughout the nation. As General Jefferson stood at the cemetery, surrounded by friends, family, and fellow soldiers, an event unfolded that would make headlines and send a stark message about the deeply rooted racial issues in the justice system. A funeral, a sacred space, should have been a time of respect. Instead, it became a battleground for justice. Officer Daniel Thompson, a cop with a history of troubling behavior, was in the vicinity. Known for his aggressive stance toward black individuals, Thompson was no stranger to controversy. His past was dotted with accusations of racial profiling and excessive force. But that day, he took it too far. As General Jefferson, standing tall despite his grief, gave his son one last salute, Officer Thompson approached the scene. Without warning, he pointed his gun directly at the general. There was no provocation, no threat, only the cruel assumption that a black man, dressed in military uniform, must be treated with suspicion. His hand, gripping the weapon, didn't falter. He was doing what so many officers like him had done before, abusing their authority and ignoring the basic decency that should be afforded to every individual, especially a grieving father. But this time, something was different. The bystanders were not silent. Witnesses immediately began recording the incident on their phones, capturing the officer's dangerous behavior. Their footage quickly spread across social media, igniting a firestorm of outrage. How could a cop, sworn to protect the public, threaten a man who had served this country with honor? The very man who had led countless missions, been decorated for bravery, and had earned the respect of his peers. Within hours, the video went viral. The news outlets picked it up, showing the world the disturbing image of a man with a gun pointed at someone who had done nothing but grieve. The backlash was swift. People across the nation were horrified, not just by the act itself, but by the undeniable truth it exposed about the ongoing racial tensions in law enforcement. General Jefferson, who had served his country with unwavering loyalty, now found himself facing not only the loss of his son, but also an unjust encounter with a system that had long treated him as less than equal. His military accolades, his service to the nation, and his dignity meant nothing in that moment. All that mattered to Officer Thompson was the color of his skin. In the wake of the incident, the community rallied behind the general. A sense of collective outrage spread like wildfire, uniting people from all walks of life. What had been a private moment of loss for one man quickly became a national symbol of the racial injustice that continues to plague the country. As the video continued to circulate, questions began to rise about Officer Thompson's record. The more people dug into his past, the more troubling revelations surfaced. He wasn't just an isolated bad apple. He was part of a system that had, time and time again, failed to hold officers accountable for their actions. His career had been marked by several complaints of misconduct, but he had never been disciplined. As the world demanded justice for General Jefferson, the question loomed: could this moment finally be the turning point for racial injustice in law enforcement? Would the nation wake up to the systemic problems that had long been ignored? And perhaps most importantly, Would this act of violence lead to the reckoning that so many have been waiting for? Within hours of the viral video being shared, the world was in shock. General Marcus Jefferson's simple act of grief, overshadowed by the unjust actions of Officer Daniel Thompson, had sparked an outrage unlike anything seen in years. What started as a tragic event for one family quickly became a symbol of the systemic racism that had been perpetuated by law enforcement for far too long. People across the nation were not just angry. They were heartbroken, disgusted, and determined that enough was enough. The footage of the incident painted a stark picture of racial injustice. As General Jefferson stood tall at his son's grave, a man who had served this country with pride, a cop with a history of abusive behavior, pointed a gun at him. It was an act that should never have happened, especially in a place where people are supposed to feel safe, a funeral. But Officer Thompson's arrogance was evident. He saw no value in the general's service or humanity. He saw only a black man, a man whose life in his eyes was disposable. What made this moment even more appalling was the fact that it was caught on tape. The video spread quickly, circulating across social media platforms, drawing attention from people of all backgrounds, races, and political affiliations. The outrage was palpable. People immediately rallied behind General Jefferson, not just because of what had happened to him personally, but because they recognized that his story was far from unique. It was a reflection of the everyday struggles that countless black men and women face when they encounter law enforcement. The harassment, the fear, the violence, and the systemic inequities that allow these actions to continue without consequence. The hashtag #Justice for General Jefferson trended for days. Public figures, activists, and community leaders spoke out against the racism embedded in the system. Protests erupted in major cities, with people marching in solidarity, demanding that Officer Thompson be held accountable for his actions. But this wasn't just about one man. This was about the deep-rooted problem of police brutality and the racial profiling that often leads to tragic outcomes. The conversation quickly expanded beyond one incident and became a national reckoning. As the pressure mounted, local news outlets, as well as international media, turned their attention to Officer Thompson's history. Investigations uncovered a disturbing pattern of previous incidents where Thompson had been accused of racial profiling, excessive force, and harassment. Yet despite the numerous complaints, no significant disciplinary action had ever been taken against him. His badge had always protected him. That is, until now. The public's outrage grew as the truth about Thompson's record became widely known. People began asking, how many other officers like him were out there? How many were operating under the radar, abusing their power and tarnishing the image of law enforcement? This wasn't just about one officer. It was about an entire system that had failed to protect the very people it was meant to serve. Amid the growing fury, General Jefferson himself became a symbol of resilience and strength. His message, shared during a press conference, was clear. He didn't want to be remembered as the man who was wronged. He wanted to be remembered as a person who fought for change, not just for himself, but for others who had been victims of similar mistreatment. This isn't just about me, he said. This is about everyone who has ever been unjustly targeted because of their skin color. This is about making sure no one ever has to go through what I've been through. As the nation continued to grapple with the fallout from the incident, the conversations surrounding racism and police brutality reached a boiling point. More and more individuals, organizations, and political leaders began calling for substantial reforms within the police force. People demanded not just accountability, but a transformation in the way law enforcement interacts with communities of color. It was clear that the time for change was now. General Jefferson's incident had triggered a nationwide dialogue, but it had also ignited something much larger, a movement. This wasn't just about one racist cop. It was about addressing the systemic issues that had been ignored for far too long. People were ready for justice, and they were prepared to fight for it, no matter how long it took. The courtroom was packed. People from across the nation had come to witness the trial of Officer Daniel Thompson, the cop who had pointed a gun at General Marcus Jefferson during his son's funeral. This wasn't just another police brutality case. It had become a symbol of the deep, systemic issues within law enforcement. The nation was watching, and everyone knew that the outcome of this trial could set a precedent for future cases involving racial profiling and police misconduct. As the trial began, the air was thick with tension. General Jefferson, still grieving the loss of his son, had to relive that traumatic moment over and over again. But the trial was not just about his pain. It was about uncovering the truth behind Officer Thompson's actions. What led him to make such a reckless, dangerous decision in the first place? Was it a momentary lapse of judgment, or was there something much darker at play? The defense tried to paint Thompson as an officer who had acted out of fear, a man who was just doing his job in what he believed to be a tense situation. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They immediately began to expose the hidden truths about Thompson's past. It wasn't just this one incident that made him a dangerous man. It was the long history of accusations against him that painted a disturbing picture. Witnesses from past cases began to speak out. They shared stories of how Officer Thompson had been accused of racial profiling, using excessive force, and making inappropriate comments about Black individuals. In fact, there had been multiple complaints lodged against him over the years. Yet despite the mounting evidence of his unprofessional behavior, he had faced little to no consequences. He had been allowed to continue his work as a police officer, his badge shielding him from accountability. As the prosecution laid out the case, it became clear that this wasn't just a rogue cop acting out of line. Officer Thompson's behavior was part of a larger, more troubling pattern within the police department. There was a systemic failure to address the concerns of the community, and an even more alarming failure to hold officers accountable for their actions. The defense, desperate to salvage Thompson's reputation, tried to redirect the attention to General Jefferson's background. They attempted to cast doubt on the general's character, suggesting that he was not as innocent as he appeared. But the jury wasn't buying it. It became clear to everyone in the courtroom that the issue at hand wasn't about General Jefferson's character or conduct. It was about the actions of a man in a position of power who had abused that power for years, unchecked and unchallenged. The testimonies from the witnesses who had known Officer Thompson were chilling. One former colleague described how Thompson had a reputation for being overly aggressive with Black individuals. Another witness, a former suspect of Thompson, spoke of being harassed and belittled during an encounter with the officer. These accounts only served to strengthen the prosecution's case and paint Thompson as a man who had been granted far too much leeway in a system that had failed to protect the public from officers like him. The courtroom was electric with tension as the defense's arguments faltered. With each new revelation about Thompson's history, it became harder for the jury to deny the truth. The more the prosecution exposed, the more the weight of the officer's past misconduct became undeniable. But the most damning piece of evidence came from the video footage of the incident itself. The stark image of Thompson pointing a gun at a grieving father at a funeral was powerful enough on its own. But when coupled with the testimonies of those who had witnessed Thompson's previous behavior, it was impossible to ignore the reality of what had happened that day. Officer Thompson was not just a rogue officer. He was part of a larger problem that had gone on for far too long. As the trial came to a close, the jury deliberated. Outside the courthouse, protests and rallies continued, with people demanding justice for General Jefferson and for the countless others who had suffered under the hands of police officers like Thompson. The nation was holding its breath. Would justice prevail? Would this trial serve as a turning point in the fight against police brutality? Or would Officer Thompson be allowed to walk free, just like so many others before him. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about a system that had allowed those actions to persist unchecked, and about a nation's struggle to confront the hard truths about racism in law enforcement. The courtroom sat in tense silence as the jury filed in to deliver their verdict. Every eye in the room was on the 12 men and women who had been tasked with deciding Officer Daniel Thompson's fate. The prosecution had presented a compelling case, and the defense had failed to create reasonable doubt. The air was thick with anticipation as the nation awaited justice for General Marcus Jefferson, a man who had suffered both personally and symbolically at the hands of a system that too often failed to protect people like him. When the foreperson of the jury finally stood up, the room seemed to hold its breath. The judge's gavel echoed through the silence as the words, "We find the defendant guilty on all charges," rang out. The decision had been made. Officer Thompson was to be held accountable for his actions. The courtroom erupted in a mix of shock, relief, and vindication. General Jefferson, though stoic in the face of such a monumental moment, felt a sense of justice wash over him. He had not just won a personal victory, his courage had brought down an officer who had, for far too long, abused his power. It was a win not just for him, but for countless others who had faced similar racial profiling, abuse of power, and lack of accountability. The guilty verdict was historic. It wasn't just about this one officer. It was about sending a message that no one, no matter how powerful or protected, was above the law. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the system might be shifting. Officer Thompson's sentence was not just a punishment for his actions, but a potential catalyst for larger reforms. The conviction sent ripples across the nation, signaling to law enforcement agencies everywhere that they could no longer operate with impunity, especially when it came to racial bias and abuse of power. Outside the courthouse, the mood was one of cautious celebration. Justice had been served, but the road ahead was still long. People filled the streets with signs that read, "Justice for all," and "No more silence." It was clear that this moment, while significant, was just a small piece of a much larger movement. The fight for equality and accountability was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. For General Jefferson, the victory was bittersweet. While he had achieved the justice he so desperately sought, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what had been lost. His son was still gone, and the grief of losing him would never fully fade. But the conviction of Officer Thompson brought a sense of closure to an agonizing chapter of his life. It was as though a small piece of the weight on his shoulders had been lifted. But even more than that, Jefferson felt a profound sense of responsibility. He knew that his story, his fight, had inspired others to take a stand. The nation had watched him face down adversity, and now people were looking to him as a symbol of courage and strength. For many, General Jefferson had become an unexpected leader in the movement for justice. His words and actions had sparked a national dialogue about racial inequality, police misconduct, and the need for meaningful change. In his press conferences, he spoke about the need for continued efforts to reform the police force, the importance of holding officers accountable, and the need for systematic changes to ensure that what happened to him never happens again. The guilty verdict was only the beginning. It didn't undo the pain that General Jefferson had suffered, nor did it fix the systemic issues that still plague law enforcement, but it sent a clear message. The fight for justice would no longer be ignored. As Officer Thompson was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom stood in silence, each person reflecting on what had just transpired. The first step toward justice had been taken, but as General Jefferson had said in his statement, "This isn't just about me." And with the conviction of Officer Thompson, the world knew it was about so much more than one man's actions. It was about a society finally demanding accountability and an end to the systemic racism that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. In the wake of Officer Thompson's sentencing, the discussions surrounding police reform intensified, igniting debates across the country. The case of General Marcus Jefferson had highlighted the systemic issues within law enforcement, and Thompson's conviction was seen as both a rare victory and a necessary catalyst for change. But as the dust settled, the larger question remained. How could the justice system evolve to prevent more instances like this from occurring? Could this case truly inspire the lasting reforms that were so urgently needed? For General Jefferson, the fight had never been about revenge. It was about demanding change. He had known from the beginning that exposing Officer Thompson's actions was just the first step in a much larger battle. Although his personal journey had led to justice, the road ahead was filled with obstacles. The injustice he had endured was a reflection of a wider problem, one that affected communities of color across the nation. The conviction had triggered national conversations on racial profiling, police brutality, and the need for law enforcement reform. Public protests, advocacy groups, and politicians began to call for greater accountability within the police force. There was a surge in interest surrounding body cameras, civilian oversight boards, and other forms of transparency that could curb abuses of power and make police forces more accountable to the public they served. But even as the nation rallied behind the calls for reform, the challenges of implementing widespread change loomed large. While many citizens pushed for new laws, policies, and training procedures, there were also significant resistance and barriers from within the very institutions that needed reform. Political leaders, both locally and nationally, faced the difficult task of balancing the desire for change with the power dynamics and entrenched interests that had existed within police unions and other influential bodies. General Jefferson used his newfound platform to address these challenges head-on. He spoke candidly about the need to create a system that held officers accountable, one that didn't rely on isolated cases or the luck of a favorable verdict. He advocated for more comprehensive education on racial biases in policing and for a complete overhaul of the structures that allowed discrimination to thrive. In his speeches, Jefferson was clear: we must not only convict the few, but transform the system that allowed them to act unchecked. At the same time, Jefferson knew that change would require more than just public outcry. He worked alongside reform-minded lawmakers, activists, and legal experts to propose measures that could provide real oversight of police forces. The push for an independent review board that would have the power to investigate police misconduct, the promotion of more diverse recruitment within law enforcement, and the implementation of more effective de-escalation techniques were all key components of the conversations he helped to spearhead. While these changes would take time, the sentencing of Officer Thompson had at least shifted the national narrative. The idea that police officers could be held accountable for their actions, especially in cases involving racial prejudice or violence, was no longer an abstract notion. It had become a reality, albeit a reality that needed to be expanded and deepened across the entire justice system. The ripple effect of Thompson's conviction also reached other areas of society. Educators, community leaders, and civil rights organizations used the case to educate people about the significance of police accountability and how it connected to larger societal issues like racial inequality, economic disparity, and access to justice. The case became a teaching moment, a case study that illustrated both the flaws in the system and the power of collective action. Despite the steps forward, it was clear that this was a long-term struggle. The road to meaningful reform was not a straight path, but for General Jefferson, the journey was worth every ounce of effort. He knew that his case was just one small part of a much larger movement, and he was determined to see it through to the end. His efforts to push for accountability and change went beyond his personal experience. They were about the future of a more just and equitable society. The legacy of Officer Thompson's conviction was not just that one officer had been sentenced to prison. It was the beginning of a new era of police accountability, one in which the American public would no longer accept the status quo. And as long as people like General Jefferson continued to lead the charge, the fight for justice would never fade into the background. The sentencing of Officer Daniel Thompson had undoubtedly sent shockwaves through the country, but it was the lasting impact of this moment on the larger fight for justice that truly defined its significance. While the national conversation around police reform had been ignited, the momentum that followed would shape the future of law enforcement practices in ways that no one could have predicted. The story of General Marcus Jefferson, his courage, and his relentless pursuit of justice would continue to inspire individuals across the nation to speak out, take action, and demand the systemic changes necessary to bring about real reform. As months passed following Thompson's conviction, Jefferson's efforts did not slow. He continued to speak on panels, at rallies, and to government officials, advocating for the very changes he believed were necessary to prevent future tragedies. One of his most notable contributions was his advocacy for the creation of a National Oversight Commission for Police Conduct, a body composed not just of law enforcement officers, but also of civilians, community leaders, and legal experts. The goal of this commission was to ensure transparency, fairness, and accountability in police practices, to hold law enforcement accountable for misconduct, and to restore the trust between communities of color and the police. At the same time, General Jefferson worked tirelessly to shine a spotlight on the broader implications of police brutality, racism, and systemic oppression that had gone unchecked for far too long. He emphasized the importance of providing communities with the tools to protect themselves and hold institutions accountable, while also ensuring that law enforcement officers were trained to understand the historical context of racial discrimination and the importance of unbiased policing. However, not everyone embraced the reforms that Jefferson championed. There were still pockets of resistance, both within the police force and within society at large, who viewed the calls for change as a threat to their power or as an attack on their profession. Police unions in particular fought vehemently against certain proposals for reform, arguing that they would hinder their ability to protect themselves in dangerous situations. Nevertheless, Jefferson and his supporters stood firm, arguing that true public safety could only be achieved when every citizen was treated equally under the law. In the years following the trial, the national landscape began to shift. More officers were charged and convicted for acts of misconduct, particularly in high-profile cases involving racial bias. The reforms that Jefferson had fought for began to gain traction as more police departments introduced community policing initiatives, body cameras, and greater accountability mechanisms. The creation of civilian oversight boards, though not without its challenges, started to become a more common practice in cities across the country. These efforts, though imperfect, marked a tangible step forward. For General Jefferson, the change was bittersweet. While he had achieved many of his goals, he never lost sight of the reason he began his fight in the first place. His son's death was an irreplaceable loss, one that could never be fully reconciled, but he had found solace in knowing that his son's legacy had made a difference in the lives of others. The young boy's tragic death had sparked a fire in Jefferson, a fire that would burn brightly for years to come, inspiring future generations to continue the work that he had started. As he looked back on the years of struggle, Jefferson remained hopeful. The fight for justice was ongoing, but he knew that real, meaningful change was possible. The conviction of Officer Thompson was just one part of the larger movement toward accountability, fairness, and equality. It was proof that the system, though flawed, could be challenged and reformed. And with each victory, whether big or small, the movement continued to grow. General Jefferson's story was no longer just his own. It had become a symbol of resilience and hope, a story that would live on in the hearts of those who believed in the possibility of a better, more just society. The road ahead remained long and uncertain, but as long as people like him continued to lead the charge, the fight for equality and justice would never falter. In the end, the lasting legacy of this case was not just the conviction of one officer, it was the powerful reminder that every individual has the ability to make a difference. It was the realization that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the pursuit of justice could and would prevail. What do you think is the most important step we can take as a society to ensure accountability in law enforcement? And how can we work together to create lasting change? If you believe in the power of justice and want to be part of the movement for change, don't forget to subscribe to the Arc of Stories for more impactful content.